And just to share one final example from this book is this wonderful engraving of the Adoration of the Magi, where you point out Balthazar, King Balthazar, who brings myrrh for the Christ child. He looks like this in the original engraving. And then about a century later, it is adapted. I'll just into a different form. It's recut. And then, so Balthasar is made a bit more conventional. He's dark skinned now. What do we make of these major changes? Because this is the same plate, but it's changed considerably.
Well, the same plate, but it's been, remember that the printing estimates on this, it's been printed tens of thousands of times by the time you get to this later impression. It's recut, and the recutting is, as you can see, somewhat it's much it's not Vierex's beautiful refined detail where you have a lot of variety of different kinds of marks. This is much flatter kind of cross-hatching, etc. And the decision to kind of make the skin of Balthazar render black in this later impression, in part is I think a response to that campaign of recutting, right? So they're re-engraving the plate. And I think there is this, by that point, an understanding that blackness has to be conveyed through skin tone, even in a black and white medium, which was not necessarily, I think, the dominant perspective in the late 1580s when the plates were originally engraved. So there is a kind of, I think, you can talk about the changes in what viewers expected and what artists, I think, sort of interpreted that an earlier engraving, and the kind of change reflects that desire to mark him as African via skin tone, not just through attributes or facial features, but to actually physically mark the skin as being darker. And that's I think it's a much bigger question than just this, but I think it was a fascinating example to me of how these two objects, the prints themselves, in the way that standard art historical language talks about prints, they're pulled from the same plate. They are made from the same object, the same index. But that index in the intervening 200, almost 180 years of its use, went through such dramatic changes that you can't talk about these two prints as being the same thing, even though they're part of this. If you looked at the Holstein sort of catalog of these prints entry, they're part of the same entry, right? Because one is just a later state of the other, but they're dramatically different things and have very different contextual circumstances.
Yes, can I just contest the claim you just made about the convention of the dark-skinned Balthasar? Because from my limited knowledge, it sort of began in the 13th century, and then it was immensely so popular to depict him as dark-skinned in Northern Europe. And think of Joost van Cleve, think of those great
the Bosch's. Yes, no, right. I don't mean that it wasn't conventional. I meant in print. Right. In prints, you didn't necessarily have to always mark the skin of African descendant people in dark cross-hatching. There's a definite back and forth through the 16th century where it's used and then it's not used as much. And so I think Vierex, when he comes to engrave this scene, I don't think he feels compelled. I mean, in fact, he doesn't, right? He doesn't mark the skin as being darker because it I think would disrupt the lighting schema that is very complicated in that particular plate in itself. So I think he makes a decision, which is quite a conventional decision, I think, at that moment, that you don't necessarily have to mark African skin as darker if there's a sort of phenotypic caricature-like representation of Africanness in terms of the earrings on the pages and the kind of representation of the face. But that's not as for Vierex, I don't think he was like, oh, I have to make it, have to mark the skin as dark. I don't think that was imperative at that moment.